Welcome to Storytime. I am Moog, and today we are finishing Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, starting with Chapter 6. But first, updates. I am so in love with Blue Lock. I feel like I say this every time now, but I am so in love with Blue Lock. I'm already caught up on the show, so I'm making my way through the manga because I just need more in my life. And who knew that I would be such a little dweebo for a soccer manga? Who knew? Certainly not I, but here we are. Um I'm reading The Golden Fool by Robin Hobb. Can't give much of a synopsis because it is the eighth book in a series. So anything I say is going to be a spoiler, but it is a high fantasy series, and Robin Hobb is amazing at writing high fantasy. Shouldn't have done that. Now I have lipstick on my finger. She's amazing at writing fantasy. She just slowly reveals things instead of just slapping you in the face with everything. So that's really cool. Uh, I finished Yu Yu Hakusho. I know you have all been waiting for that. I started Cheers. Yeah, like the show Cheers with Ted Danson. Started that. It's kind of great. It's kind of great. Started with season 1. Like season 1 through 4 is available on Hulu right now, and I just really like it. And I was worried that it would be like a lot of comedies that are like older and even new ones. I just worried that it would be like a punch down comedy, but it's not. They like riff on each other really well. It's just so good. I enjoy it. I enjoy Cheers. I'm just gonna say it. I enjoy Cheers. And I think that's all. I did not make it very far in the fall of the House of Usher. I am watching it by myself, and I've only watched the first 2 episodes. So far, so good. Love the mix of the different Poe references and everything like that, and love that it is mostly a family drama, as the fall of House of Usher is, but a little sprinkling of terror, and it's great. It's great. And I think that's it. All right, let's do it. Let's finish Through the Looking Glass. I like forgot what it was called for a second. We're starting with chapter 6. I forgot where we left off. So, I need to do a recap. Duh. Okay, so Through the Looking Glass. Alice is in her room talking to Dinah, her cat, and looks through the looking glass and is like, "Oh, I wonder what it's like in this other world. Like everything that I can see is backwards, but like is the fireplace lit like it is here? Like what else is going on in the house?" So as she's talking to Dinah, she is like, "Oh, what if the mirror became like a silvery little screen?" And then it does become a silvery little screen, and she walks through and everything is backwards. And yes, the fireplace is lit. Of course it is. Um, and she meets the Red Queen, she meets the White, no, she meets the White Queen, she meets the White King, and she meets the daughter who is a pawn, Lily. And she's helping them, but they can't see or hear her. And she is wandering around this house. I skipped a bunch, but that's fine. She's wandering around the house. She goes outside and she's trying to get to this beautiful like hill so that she can see everything that's around her. And so she's trying to get there and everything is just leading her back to the house. And so she goes this way, she goes that way, blah blah blah. A bunch of flowers are very sassy to her, but they lead her to the Red Queen. And the Red Queen is there and is telling her about sort of kind of about the world, but like Lewis Carroll, everything is all mushed mushed together and nonsensy and silly. And so Alice realizes that the whole world is kind of like a chessboard. And she's like, "Well, I want to play chess." And the Red Queen is like, "Cool, you can be the white pawn in place of the red or the White Queen's daughter, Lily." And she gives her all of these instructions, and she's like, "Once you get to this square, this is going to happen. Once you get to this square, this is going to happen." Blah, 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 blah. Alice goes about her day And the things do happen. We get a gnat who loves puns, of course. We run into the White Queen, who she sees and remembers time like forward. So she was putting a band-aid on, and then she started bleeding, and then she pricked her finger. So like opposite. It's real fun. And she comes across Tweedledee and Tweedledum, which is great. We are in the forest of no name, or the place of no name, and we meet a fawn. But because we're in this one section, the fawn is like, I can't tell you my name. Can you tell me your name? And Alice is like, no, but it definitely starts with an L. And then they leave that place, and the deer is like, oh, I'm a fawn, and you're a human, and then like scampers off. Um, and then we go to a shop that is run by a knitting turtle, because of course it is. And Alice buys an egg, and the shopkeeper is like, okay, well, you have to go get it because I never pick anything up. So Alice is now going through the shop, and as she keeps getting closer to the egg is getting farther and farther away, and things are turning into trees around her. And that is where we left off. Chapter 6. Humpty Dumpty. However, the egg only got larger and larger and more human. When she had come within a few yards of it, she saw that it had eyes and nose and mouth, and when she had come close to it, she saw clearly that it was Humpty Dumpty himself. "It can't be anybody else," she said to herself. "I'm as certain of it as if his name were written all over his face." It might have been written 100 times easily on that enormous face. Humpty Dumpty was sitting with his legs crossed on top of a high wall, such a narrow one that Alice quite wondered how he could keep his balance, and as his eyes were steadily fixed in the opposite direction, and he didn't take the least notice of her, she thought he must be a stuffed figure, after all. "And how exactly like an egg he is," she said aloud, standing with her hands ready to catch him, for she was every moment expecting him to fall. It's very provoking," Humpty Dumpty said, after a long silence, looking away from Alice as he spoke, "to be called an egg. Very." "I said you looked like an egg, sir," Alice gently explained, "and some eggs are very pretty, you know," she added, hoping to turn her remark into a sort of compliment. "Some people," said Humpty Dumpty, looking away from her as usual, "have no more sense than a baby." Alice didn't know what to say to this. It wasn't at all like conversation, she thought, as he never said anything to her. In fact, his last remark was evidently addressed to a tree. So she stood and softly repeated to herself, "Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty in his place again." That last line is much too long for the poetry, she added almost out loud, forgetting that Humpty Dumpty would hear her. "Don't stand chattering to yourself like that," Humpty Dumpty said, looking at her for the first time. "But tell me your name and your business." "My name is Alice, but it's a stupid name enough," Humpty Dumpty interrupted impatiently. "What does it mean?" "Must a name mean something?" Alice asked doubtfully. "Of course it must," Humpty Dumpty said with a short laugh. "My name means the shape I am, and a good handsome shape it is, too. With a name like yours, you might be any shape almost." "Why do you sit out here all alone?" said Alice, not wishing to begin an argument. "Why, because there's nobody with me," cried Humpty Dumpty. "Did you think I didn't know the answer to that? Ask another." "Don't you think you'd be safer down on the ground?" Alice went on, not with any idea of making another riddle, but simply in her good-natured anxiety for the odd creature. "That wall is so very narrow." "What a tremendously easy riddle you ask," Humpty Dumpty growled out. "Of course I don't think so. Why, if I ever did fall off, which there's no chance of, but if I did, here he pursed up his lips and looked so solemn and grand that Alice could hardly help laughing. If I did fall, he went on, the king has promised me, you may turn pale if you like. You didn't think I was going to say that, did you? The king has promised me with his own mouth to send all his horses and all of his men, Alice interrupted rather unwisely. Now I declare that's too bad, Humpty Dumpty cried, breaking into a sudden passion. You've been listening at doors and behind trees and down chimneys, or you couldn't have known it. Well, I haven't indeed, Alice said very gently. It's in a book. Ah, well, they may write such things in a book, Humpty Dumpty said in a calmer tone. That's what you call a history of England, that is. Now, take a good look at me. I'm one that has spoken to a king. I am. Perhaps you'll never see such another, and to show you I'm not proud, you may shake hands with me. And he grinned, almost from ear to ear, as he leant forward, and as nearly as possible fell off the wall in doing so, and offered Alice his hand. She watched him a little anxiously as she took it. If he smiled much more, the ends of his mouth might meet behind, she thought. And then I don't know what would happen to his head. I'm afraid it would come off. Yes, all his horses and all his men, Humpty Dumpty went on. They'd pick me up again in a minute, they would. However, this conversation is going on a little too fast. Let's go back to the last remark but one. Well, I'm afraid I can't quite remember it, Alice said politely. In that case we start fresh, said Humpty Dumpty, and it's my turn to choose a subject. Oh, he speaks about it just as if it was a game, thought Alice. So there's a question for you. How old did you say that you were? Alice made a short calculation and said, 7 years and 6 months. Wrong, Humpty Dumpty exclaimed triumphantly. You never said a word like it. Well, I thought you meant how old are you? Alice explained. If I'd meant that, I'd have said it, said Humpty Dumpty. Alice didn't want to begin another argument, so she said nothing. 7 years and 6 months, Humpty Dumpty repeated thoughtfully. An uncomfortable sort of age. Now, if you'd asked my advice, I'd have said leave off at 7. But it's too late now. Well, I never ask advice about growing, Alice said indignantly. Too proud? The other inquired. Alice felt even more indignant at this suggestion. Well, I mean, she said, that one can't help growing older. One can't, perhaps, said Humpty Dumpty, but two can. With proper assistance, you might have left off at 7. What a beautiful belt you've got on, Alice suddenly remarked. They had had quite enough of the subject of age, she thought, and if they really were to take turns in choosing subjects, it was her turn now. At least, she corrected herself on second thoughts, a beautiful cravat. I should have said, no, a belt, I beg your pardon, she added in dismay, for Humpty Dumpty looked thoroughly offended, and she began to wish she hadn't chosen that subject. If only I knew, she thought to herself, which was neck and which was waist. And we do have a picture of Alice and Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty looks frightening, I must say. Evidently, Humpty Dumpty was very angry, though he said nothing for a minute or two. When he did speak again, it was in a deep growl. It is a most provoking thing, he said at last, when a person doesn't know a cravat from a belt. I know it's very ignorant of me, Alice said, in so humble a tone that Humpty Dumpty relented. It's a cravat, child, and a beautiful one, as you say. It's a present from the White King and Queen. There now. Is it really? Said Alice, quite pleased to find that she had chosen a good subject after all. They gave it to me, Humpty Dumpty continued thoughtfully, as he crossed one knee over the other and clasped his hands round it. They gave it to me for an unbirthday present. I beg your pardon, Alice said with a puzzled air. Well, I'm not offended, said Humpty Dumpty. I mean, what is an unbirthday present? A present given when it isn't your birthday, of course. Alice considered a little. I like birthday presents best, she said at last. You don't know what you're talking about, cried Humpty Dumpty. How many days are there in a year? 365, said Alice. And how many birthdays have you? One. And if you take one from 365, what remains? 364, of course. Humpty Dumpty looked doubtful. I'd rather see that done on paper, he said. Alice couldn't help smiling as she took out her memorandum book and worked the sum for him. 365 minus 1 equals 364. Humpty Dumpty took the book and looked at it carefully. That seems to be done right, he began. Oh, you're holding it upside down, Alice interrupted. To be sure I was, Humpty Dumpty said happily as she turned it round for him. I thought it looked a little odd, as I was saying, that seems to be done right, though I haven't time to look it over thoroughly just now, and that shows that there are 364 days when you might get birthday presents. Oh, certainly, said Alice, and only one birthday presents. You know, there's glory for you. I don't know what you mean by glory, Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. Of course you don't, till I tell you. I meant there's a nice knock-down argument for you. But glory doesn't mean a nice knock-down argument, Alice objected. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in rather a scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. Well, the question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master. That's all. Alice was too puzzled to say anything, so after a minute Humpty Dumpty began again. They've a temper, some of them, particularly verbs. They're the proudest. Adjectives you can do anything with, but not verbs. However, I can manage a whole lot of them, impenetrably. That's what I say. Would you tell me, please, said Alice, what that means? Now, you talk like a reasonable child, said Humpty Dumpty, looking very much pleased. I meant by impenetrably that we've had enough of this subject, and it would be just as well if you'd mention what you mean to do next, as I suppose you don't mean to stop here all the rest of your life. That's a great deal to make one word mean, Alice said in a thoughtful tone. When I make a word do a lot of work like that, said Humpty Dumpty, I always pay it extra. Oh, said Alice. She was too much puzzled to make any other remark. You should see 'em come round me of a Saturday night, Humpty Dumpty went on, wagging his head gravely from side to side, for to get their wages, you know. Alice didn't venture to ask what he paid them with, and so you see I can't tell you. Oh, you seem very clever at explaining words, sir, said Alice. Would you kindly tell me the meaning of the poem called Jabberwocky? That was the poem that we read, like, right when we got into the Looking Glass world. Let's hear it, said Humpty Dumpty. I can explain all the poems that ever were invented, and a good many that haven't been invented just yet. This sounds very hopeful, so Alice repeated the first voice. "'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and she mome wraths outgrabe." "That's enough to begin with," Humpty Dumpty interrupted. "There are plenty of hard words there. Brillig means 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the time when you begin broiling things for dinner." "Oh, that'll do very well," said Alice. And slithy?" "Well, slithy means lithe and slimy. Lithe is the same as active. You see, it's like a portmanteau. There are two meanings packed up into one word." "Oh, I see it now," Alice remarked thoughtfully. "And what are toves?" "Well, toves are something like badgers. They're something like lizards. And they're something like corkscrews." "They must be very curious-looking creatures." "They are that," said Humpty Dumpty. "Also, they make their nests under sundials. Also, they live on cheese." "And what's to gyre and to gimble?" "To gyre is to go round and round like a gyroscope. To gimble is to make holes like a gimlet." "And the wabe is the grass plot. And the wabe is the grass plot round a sundial, I suppose," said Alice, surprised at her own ingenuity. "Of course it is. It's called a wabe, because it goes a long way before and a long way behind it." "Oh, and a long way beyond it on each side," Alice added. "Exactly so. Well then, mimsy is flimsy and miserable. There's another portmanteau for you. And a borogove is a thin, shabby-looking bird with its feathers sticking out all round. Something like a live mop." "And then mome wraths," said Alice. "I'm afraid I'm giving you a great deal of trouble." "Well, a wrath is a sort of green pig, but mome I'm not certain about. I think it's short for from home, meaning that they'd lost their way, "And what does outgrabe mean?" "Outgribbing is something between bellowing and whistling, and a kind of sneeze in the middle. However, you'll hear it done. Maybe, down in the wood yonder, and when you've once heard it, you'll be quite content. Who's been repeating all that hard stuff to you?" "I read it in a book," said Alice. "But I had some poetry repeated to me, much easier than that, by Tweedledee, I think it was." "As to poetry, said Humpty Dumpty, stretching out one of his green hands, "I can repeat poetry as well as other folk, if it comes to that." "Oh, it needn't come to that," Alice hastily said, hoping to keep him from beginning. "The piece I'm going to repeat," he went on without noticing her remark, "was written entirely for your amusement." Alice felt, in that case, she really ought to listen to it, so she sat down and said, "Thank you," rather sadly. "In winter when the fields are white, I sing this song for your delight. Only I don't sing it," he added, as an explanation. "Oh, I see that you don't," said Alice. "If you can see whether I'm singing or not, you've sharper eyes than most," Humpty Dumpty remarked severely, as Alice was silent. "In spring, when woods are getting green, I'll try and tell you what I mean." "Oh, thank you very much," said Alice. "In summer, when the days are long, perhaps you'll understand the song. In autumn, when the leaves are brown, take pen and ink and write it down." "Oh, I will if I can remember it so long," said Alice. "You needn't go on making remarks like that," Humpty Dumpty said. "They're not sensible, and they put me out. I sent a message to the fish. I told him, 'This is what I wish.' The little fishes of the sea, they sent an answer back to me. The little fish's answer was, "We cannot do it, sir, because—" "Oh, I'm afraid I don't quite understand," said Alice. "It gets easier further on," Humpty Dumpty replied. "I sent to them again to say, it will be better to obey. The fish's answer was a grin. 'Why, what a temper you are in!' I told them once, I told them twice, they should not listen to advice. I took a kettle large and new, fit for the deed I had to do. My heart went hop, my heart went thump, I filled the kettle at the pump. Then someone came to me and said, 'The little fishes are in bed.' I said to him, I said it plain, 'Then you must wake them up again.' I said it very loud and clear, I went and shouted in his ear." Humpty Dumpty raised his voice almost to a scream, and he repeated this verse. And Alice thought with a shudder, "I shouldn't have been the messenger for anything." "But he was very stiff and proud," he said, "you needn't shout so loud. And he was very proud and stiff, he said, 'I go and wake them if—' I took a corkscrew from the shelf, I went to wake them up myself. And when I found the door was locked, I pulled and pushed and kicked and knocked. And when I found the door was shut, I tried to turn the handle, but—" There was a long pause. "Was that all?" Alice timidly asked. "That's all," said Humpty Dumpty. "Goodbye." This was rather sudden, Alice thought, but after such a very strong hint that she ought to be going, she felt that it would hardly be civil to stay. So she got up and held out her hand. "Goodbye, till we meet again," she said as cheerfully as she could. "I shouldn't know you again if we did meet," Humpty Dumpty replied in a discontented tone, giving her one of his fingers to shake. "You're still exactly like other people." "Well, the face is what one goes by, generally," Alice remarked in a thoughtful tone. "That's just what I complain of," said Humpty Dumpty. "Your face is the same as everybody has, the two eyes, so—" marking their places in the air with his thumb, "nose in the middle, mouth underneath. It's always the same. Now, if you had the two eyes on the same side of the nose, for instance, or the mouth at the top, that would be some help." "It wouldn't look nice," Alice objected, but Humpty Dumpty only shut his eyes and said, "Wait till you've tried." And we have a picture of Humpty Dumpty yelling at the messenger. Alice waited a minute to see if he would speak again, but as he never opened his eyes or took any further notice of her, she said, "Goodbye," once more, and, getting no answer to this, she quietly walked away. But she couldn't help saying to herself as she went, "Of all the unsatisfactory—" She repeated this aloud, as it was a great comfort to have such a long word to say. "Of all the unsatisfactory people I ever met—" She never finished the sentence, for at this moment a heavy crash shook the forest from end to end. End of chapter 6. All right, chapter 6, Humpty Dumpty, and let me tell ya, he is quite the wordsmith. Like everybody else, he is like, "Who are you?" making demands like everybody else in this world seems to do. And Alice is like, "Can you tell me what this means? Like, I don't understand." And he's explaining what these words mean, and Alice is like, "Well, that's a lot of heavy lifting." And he was like, "Yeah, it is. And the words that I use to do a lot of heavy lifting, I pay extra for." And so Alice is like, "Okay, well, you know a lot about words. Can you tell me what this poem Jabberwocky means?" And he's like, "All right, lay it on me." And she repeats just the first, like, little section of it, and they're going word by word of what each of the things mean, which makes sense, obviously. And then Humpty Dumpty just kind of decides that he's done with her. And instead of saying goodbye like a normal being, just closes his eyes. And Alice is like, "All right, well, I'll see you again sometime. And Humpty Dumpty's like, I would never even recognize you if I did because you look exactly the same as literally everybody else. And she's like, no, I don't. And you just look at my face. And he's like, yeah, you look exactly like everybody else. Your eyes are up here, your nose is here, your mouth is here, blah, blah, blah. Mix it up a little, why don't you? And Alice is like, no. And so Humpty Dumpty keeps his eyes closed, and Alice doesn't really know what to do, and it's just like, all right, bye. And then there's a huge thump from the forest, and that's where the chapter ended. All right, chapter 7. The Lion and the Unicorn. I'm intrigued. The next moment, soldiers came running through the wood, at first in 2s and 3s, then 10 or 20 together, and at last in such crowds that they seemed to fill the whole forest. Alice got behind a tree, for fear of being run over, and watched them go by. She thought that in all her life she had never seen soldiers so uncertain on their feet. They were always tripping over something or other, and whenever one went down, several more always fell over him, so that the ground was soon covered with little heaps of men. Then came the horses, having 4 feet. These managed rather better than the foot soldiers, but even they stumbled now and then, and it seemed to be a regular rule that whenever a horse stumbled, the rider fell off instantly. The confusion got worse every moment, and Alice was very glad to get out of the wood into an open place, where she found the White King seated on the ground, busily writing in his memorandum book. Well, I've sent them all, the king cried, in a tone of delight, on seeing Alice. Did you happen to meet any soldiers, my dear, as you came through the wood? Well, yes, I did, said Alice. Several thousand, I should think. 4,207. That's the exact number, the king said, referring to his book. I couldn't send all the horses, you know, because 2 of them are wanted in the game, and I haven't sent the 2 messengers either. They're both gone to the town. Just look along the road, and tell me if you can see either of them. I see nobody on the road, said Alice. I only wish I had such eyes, the king remarked in a fretful tone, to be able to see nobody. And at that distance, too, why, it's as much as I can do to see real people by this light. And we do have a picture of all of the horses and soldiers stumbling and falling. It's a mess. It's a mess. All this was lost on Alice, who was still looking intently along the road, shading her eyes with one hand. Oh, I see somebody now, she exclaimed at last, but he's coming very slowly, and what curious attitudes he goes into. For the messenger kept skipping up and down and wriggling like an eel as he came along, with his great hands spread out like fans on each side. Not at all, said the king. He's an Anglo-Saxon messenger, and those are Anglo-Saxon attitudes. He only does them when he's happy. His name is Haiga. Nope. And then in parentheses, it says he pronounced it so as to rhyme with mayor, hayer. Haya, hayer. It's spelled Haigha. So I guess hair, hair. I appreciate the little side note in the parentheses, however. I love my love with an H. Alice couldn't help beginning, because he is happy. I hate him with an H, because he is hideous. I fed him with, with ham sandwiches and hay. His name is Haya, and he lives on the hill, the king remarked simply, without the least idea that he was joining in the game, while Alice was still hesitating for the name of a town beginning with H. The old messengers called Hadda. I must have 2, you know, to come and go, one to come and one to go. I beg your pardon, said Alice. It isn't respectable to beg, said the king. I only meant I didn't understand, said Alice. Why one to come and one to go? Don't I tell you? The king repeated impatiently. I must have 2 to fetch and carry. One to fetch and one to carry. At this moment the messenger arrived. He was far too much out of breath to say a word, and could only wave his hands about and make the most fearful faces at the poor king. "Well, this young lady loves you with an H," the king said, introducing Alice in the hope of turning off the messenger's attention from himself, but it was no use. The Anglo-Saxon attitudes only got more extraordinary every moment, while the great eyes rolled wildly from side to side. "You alarm me," said the king. "I feel faint. Give me a ham sandwich." On which the messenger, to Alice's great amusement, opened the bag that hung round his neck and handed a sandwich to the king, who devoured it greedily. "Another sandwich," said the king. "There's nothing more but hay left now," the messenger said, peeping into the bag. "Hay, then," the king murmured in a faint whisper. Alice was glad to see that it revived him a good deal. "There's nothing like eating hay when you're faint," he remarked to her after he munched away. "I should think throwing cold water over you would be better," suggested Alice. "Or some sal volatile." And there is an asterisk there, and it says smelling salts. "I didn't say there was nothing better," the king replied. "I said that there was nothing like it," which Alice did not venture to deny. "Who did you pass on the road?" the king went on, holding out his hand to the messenger for some more hay. "Nobody," said the messenger. "Quite right," said the king. "This young lady saw him too, so of course nobody walks slower than you." "I do my best," the messenger said in a sullen tone. "I'm sure nobody walks much faster than I do." "We can't do that," said the king, "or else he'd have been here first. However, now you've got your breath, you may tell us what happened in the town." "I'll whisper it," said the messenger, putting his hand to his mouth in the shape of a trumpet, and stooping so as to get close to the king's ear. Alice was sorry for this, as she wanted to hear the news too. However, instead of whispering, he simply shouted at the top of his voice, "They're at it again!" "Do you call that a whisper?" cried the poor king, jumping up and shaking himself. "If you do such a thing, I'll have you buttered." I went through and through my head like an earthquake. It would have been a very tiny earthquake, thought Alice. "Who are at it again?" she ventured to ask. "Why, the king and the unicorn, of course," said the king. "Fighting for the crown?" "Yes, to be sure," said the king. "And the best of the joke is that it's my crown all the while. Let's run and see them." And they trotted off, Alice repeating to herself as she ran the words of an old song. The lion and the unicorn were fighting for the crown. The lion beat the unicorn all round the town. Some gave them white bread, some gave them brown, some gave them plum cake, and drummed them out of town. "Does the one that wins get the crown?" she asked as well as she could, for the run was putting her quite out of breath. "Dear me, no," said the king. "What an idea!" "Would you be good enough," Alice panted out after running a little further, "to stop a minute, just to get one's breath again?" "I'm good enough," the king said, "only I'm not strong enough. You see, a minute goes by so fearfully quick, you might as well stop a bandersnatch." Alice had no more breath for talking, so they trotted on in silence till they came in sight of a great crowd in the middle of which the lion and unicorn were fighting. They were in such a cloud of dust that at first Alice could not make out which was which, but she soon managed to distinguish the unicorn by his horn. They placed themselves close to where Hadda, the other messenger, was standing watching the fight, with a cup of tea in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other. "Oh, he's only just out of prison, and he hadn't finished his tea when he was sent in," Hare whispered to Alice, "and they only give them oyster shells in there, so you see he's very hungry and thirsty. How are you, dear child?" he went on, putting his arm affectionately around Hadda's neck. Hadda looked round and nodded, and went on with his bread and butter. "Were you happy in prison, dear child?" said Hea. Hadda looked round once more, and this time A tear or two trickled down his cheek, but not a word would he say. "Speak, can't you?" Hare cried impatiently, but Hedda only munched away and drank some more tea. "Speak, won't you?" cried the king. "How are you getting on with the fight?" Hedda made a desperate effort, and swallowed a large piece of bread and butter. "They're getting on very well," he said in a choking voice. "Each of them had been down about 87 times. "Well, then I suppose they'll soon bring the white bread and the brown?" Alice ventured to remark. "I'm waiting for 'em now," said Hedda. "This is a bit of it as I'm eating." There was a pause in the fight just then, and the lion and the unicorn sat down, panting, while the king called out, "10 minutes allowed for refreshments." Hea and Hedda set to work at once, carrying round trays of white and brown bread. Alice took a piece to taste, but it was very dry. "I don't think they'll fight any more today," the king said to Hedda. "Go and order the drums to begin." And Hedda went bounding away like a grasshopper. For a minute or two Alice stood silent, watching him. Suddenly she brightened up. "Look, look!" she cried, pointing eagerly. "There's the White Queen running across the country." She came flying out of the wood over yonder. Oh, how fast those queens can run! "There's some enemy after her, no doubt," the king said, without even looking. "That wood's full of them." "But aren't you going to run and help her?" Alice asked, very much surprised at his taking it so quietly. "No use, no use," said the king. "She runs so fearfully quick. You might as well try to catch a bandersnatch. But I'll make a memorandum about her, if you like. She's a dear good creature," he repeated softly to himself as he opened his memorandum book. "Do you spell creature with a double E?" "Yes." At this moment the unicorn sauntered by them, and his hands in his pockets. "I had the best of it this time," he said to the king, just glancing at him as he passed. A little," the king replied, rather nervously. "You shouldn't have run him through with your horn, you know." "I didn't hurt him," the unicorn said carelessly, and he was going on with his eye when his eyes happened to fall upon Alice. He turned round instantly and stood for some time looking at her with an air of deepest disgust. "What is this?" he said at last. "This is a child," Hare replied eagerly, coming in front of Alice to introduce her, and spreading out both his hands towards her in an Anglo-Saxon attitude. "We only found it today. It's as large as life, and twice as natural." "I always thought they were fabulous monsters," said the unicorn. "Is it alive?" "It can talk," said Hare, solemnly. The unicorn looked dreamily at Alice, and said, "Talk, child." Alice could not help her lips curling into a smile as she began. "Do you know, I always thought unicorns were fabulous monsters, too. I never saw one alive before." "Well, now that you have seen each other," said the unicorn, "if you'll believe in me, I'll believe in you. Is that a bargain?" "Yes, if you like," said Alice. "Come, fetch out a plum cake, old man," the unicorn went on, turning from her to the king. "None of your brown bread for me." "Certainly, certainly," the king muttered, and beckoned to Hare. "Open the bag," he whispered. "Quick! Not that one. That's full of hay." Hare took a large cake out of the bag and gave it to Alice to hold, while he got out a dish and carving knife. How they all came out of it, Alice couldn't guess. It was just like a conjuring trick, she thought. The lion had joined them while this was all going on. He looked very tired and sleepy, and his eyes were half shut. "What's this?" he said lazily, blinking at Alice, and speaking in a deep, low tone that sounded like a tolling of a great bell. "Ah, what is it now?" the unicorn cried eagerly. "You'll never guess. I couldn't." The lion looked at Alice wearily. "Are you animal, or vegetable, or mineral?" he said, yawning at every other word. "A fabulous monster," the unicorn cried out before Alice could reply. Then hand round the plum cake, monster, the lion said, lying down and putting his chin in his paws. And sit down, both of you, to the king and the unicorn. Fair play with the cake, you know. The king was evidently very uncomfortable at having to sit down between the two great creatures, but there was no other place for him. What a fight we might have for the crown now, the unicorn said, looking slyly up at the crown, which the king was nearly shaking off his head. He trembled so much. I should win easy, said the lion. I'm not so sure of that, said the unicorn. Why? I beat you all round the town, you chicken, the unicorn replied angrily, half getting up as he spoke. Here the king interrupted to prevent the quarrel going on. He was very nervous, and his voice quite quivered. All round the town, he said. That's a good long way. Did you go by the old bridge or the marketplace? You get the best view by the old bridge. There is a picture of Alice holding the cake between the lion and the unicorn. Alice had seated herself on the bank of a little brook, with a great dish on her knees, and was sawing away diligently with a knife. It's very provoking, she said in reply to the lion. She was getting quite used to being called the monster. I've cut several slices already, but they always join on again. If you don't know how to manage looking-glass cakes, the unicorn remarked, hand it round first and cut it afterwards. This sounded nonsense, but Alice very obediently got up and carried the dish round, and the cake divided itself into 3 pieces as she did so. Now cut it up, said the lion, as she returned to her place with the empty dish. I said this isn't fair, cried the unicorn, as Alice sat with the knife in her hand, very much puzzled how to begin. The monster has given the lion twice as much as me. She kept none for herself, anyhow, said the lion. Do you like plum cake, monster? Before Alice could answer him, the drums began. Where the noise came from she couldn't make out. The air seemed full of it, and it rang through and through her head, till she felt quite deafened. She turned to her feet and sprang across the little brook in terror, and had just time to see the lion and the unicorn rise to their feet with angry looks at being interrupted in their feast, before she dropped to her knees and put her hands over her ears, vainly trying to shut out the dreadful uproar. If that doesn't drum them out of town, she thought to herself, nothing ever will. That is the end of chapter 7. All right, so Alice has left Humpty Dumpty, and she comes across all of the king's horses and all of the king's men. Well, not all of them, that is quite an exaggeration. It is most of them. And they are stumbling about as they are making their way through the forest, and they hear a big uproar, if you will. Well, actually, a messenger comes over, and the king is just famished, and so the messenger gives the king a ham sandwich, obviously, and then he only has one ham sandwich, so then he gives him hay, obviously, and then they hear an uproar, and it is a lion and a unicorn fighting for the crown, and don't be silly, they're not actually going to get the crown. The king keeps the crown. So they go over there, they're fighting, blah, blah, blah. We come across the other messenger, Hatta, and he is eating his bread and butter. He is starving because he's been in prison all day. And we see the lion and the unicorn, and the unicorn just like pierces the lion with its horn because that's what you do as a unicorn, apparently. And so they all take a break for bread, both white bread and brown bread, and Alice took a little bit for herself, but it is far too dry, and she's like, well, nobody's going to be fighting anymore. And so they sit down to have some plum cake, and obviously you have to pass the cake around before you slice it. Alice tried multiple times to slice the cake and then to pass it around, but the cake just kept rejoining, just That's what I imagine the cake was doing, was making that noise. Um, and then the drums start playing, and Alice is like, well, if it doesn't drive the lion and the unicorn out of town, I don't know what will. And that's where we ended. Okay. Okay. Chapter 8. It's my own invention. After a while, the noise seemed gradually to die away, till all was dead silence, and Alice lifted up her head in some alarm. There was no one to be seen, and her first thought was that she must have been dreaming about the lion and the unicorn and those odd Anglo-Saxon messengers. However, there was the great dish still lying at her feet, on which she had tried to cut the plum cake. So I wasn't dreaming after all, she said to herself. Unless we're all part of the same dream, only I do hope it's my dream and not the Red King's. I don't like belonging to another person's dream, she went on, a rather complaining tone. I've a great mind to go and wake him and see what happens. At this moment, her thoughts were interrupted by a loud shouting of, Ahoy! Ahoy, check! And a king dressed in crimson armor came galloping down upon her, brandishing a great club. Just as he reached her, the horse stopped suddenly. You're my prisoner, the knight cried, as he tumbled off his horse. Startled as she was, Alice was more frightened for him than for herself at the moment, and watched him with some anxiety as he mounted again. As soon as he was uncomfortably in the saddle, he began once more, You're my... But here another voice broke in. Ahoy! Ahoy, check! And Alice looked round in some surprise for the new enemy. This time it was the White Knight. He drew up at Alice's side and tumbled off his horse just as the Red Knight had done. Then he got on again, and the two knights sat and looked at each other for some time without speaking. Alice looked from one to the other in some bewilderment. She's my prisoner, you know, the Red Knight said at last. Yes, but I came and rescued her, the White Knight replied. Well, we must fight for her then, said the Red Knight, as he took up his helmet, which hung from his saddle, and was something the shape of a horse's head, and put it on. You will observe the rules of battle, of course, the White Knight remarked, putting on his helmet too. I always do, said the Red Knight, and they began banging away at each other with such fury that Alice got behind a tree to be out of the way of the blows. Oh, I wonder now what the rules of battle are, she said to herself, as she watched the fight, timidly peeping out from her hiding-place. One rule seems to be that if one knight hits the other, he knocks him off his horse, and if he misses, he tumbles off himself. And another rule seems to be that if they hold their clubs with their arms, if they were Punch and Judy, what a noise they make when they tumble, just like a whole set of fire-irons falling into the fender. And how quiet the horses are. They let them get off and on just as if they were tables. Another rule of battle that Alice had not noticed seemed to be that they always fell on their heads, and the battle ended with their both falling off in the same way, side by side. When they got up again, they shook hands, and then the Red Knight mounted and galloped off. It was glorious victory, wasn't it? Said the White Knight, as he came up panting. Well, I don't know, Alice said doubtfully. I don't want to be anybody's prisoner. I want to be a queen. Ah, so you will, when you've crossed the next brook, said the White Knight. I'll see you safe to the other end of the wood, and then I must go back, you know. That's the end of my move. Thank you very much, said Alice. May I help you off with your helmet? It was evidently more than he could manage by himself. However, she managed to shake him out of it at last. Now we can breathe more easily, said the knight, putting off his shaggy hair with both hands, and turning his gentle face and large, mild eyes to Alice. She thought she had never seen such a strange-looking soldier in all her life. He was dressed in tin armor, which seemed to fit him very badly, and he had an odd-shaped little deal box fastened across his shoulders, upside down, and with the lid hanging open. Alice looked at it with great curiosity. Here is a picture of the Red Knight and the White Knight a-fightin'. "I see you're admiring my little box," the knight said in a friendly tone. "It's my own invention, to keep clothes and sandwiches in. You see, I carry it upside down so that the rain can't get in." "And the things can get out?" Alice gently remarked. "Do you know the lid's open?" "I didn't know it," the knight said, a shade of vexation passing over his face. "Then all the things must have fallen out, and the box is no use without them." He unfastened it as he spoke, and was just going to throw it into the bushes, when a sudden thought seemed to strike him, and he hung it carefully on a tree. "Can you guess why I did that?" he said. "Oh, can you guess why I did that?" he said to Alice. Alice shook her head. "In hopes that some bees might make a nest in it. Then I should get the honey." "But you've got a beehive, or something like one, fastened to the saddle," said Alice. "Yes, it's a good beehive," the knight said in a discontented voice. "One of the best kind. But not a single bee has come near it yet, and the other thing is mousetrap. I suppose the mice keep the bees out, or the bees keep the mice out. I don't know which." "I was wondering what the mousetrap was for," said Alice. "It isn't very likely there would be any mice on the horse's back." "Not very likely, perhaps," said the knight. "But if they do come, I don't choose to have them running all about. You see," he went on after a pause, "it's as well to be provided for everything. That's the reason the horse has all those anklets round its feet." "But what are they for?" said Alice, in a tone of great curiosity. "To guard against the bites of sharks," the knight replied. "It's an invention of my own. And now help me on. I'll go with you to the end of the wood. What's that dish for?" "It's meant for plum cake," said Alice. "Well, we'd better take it with us," the knight said. "It'll come in handy if we find any plum cake. Help me to get it into this bag." They took a long time to manage, though Alice held the bag open very carefully, because the knight was so very awkward in putting in the dish. The first two or three times he tried, he fell in himself instead. "It's rather a tight fit, you see," he said, as they got it in at last. "There are so many candlesticks in the bag," and he hung it to the saddle, which was already loaded with bunches of carrots and fire-irons and many other things. "I hope you've got your hair well fastened on." "Excuse me, knight, this hair is real. Doesn't need to be fastened," he continued as they set off. "Only in the usual way," Alice said, smiling. "Oh, that's hardly enough," he said anxiously. "You see, the wind is so very strong here. It's as strong as soup. I love a good strong soup." "Have you invented a plan for keeping the hair from being blown off?" Alice inquired. "Not yet," said the king, "but I've got a plan for keeping it from falling off." "I should like to hear it very much." "First, you take an upright stick," said the knight. "Then you make your hair creep up it, like a fruit tree. Now, the reason hair falls off is because it hangs down. Things never fall upwards, you know. It's a plan of my own invention. You may try it, if you like." It didn't sound like a comfortable plan, Alice thought, and for a few minutes she walked on in silence, puzzling over the idea, and every now and then stopping to help the poor knight, who certainly was not a good rider. Whenever the horse stopped, which it did very often, he fell off in front, and whenever it went again, which it generally did rather suddenly, he fell off behind. Otherwise, he kept on pretty well, except that he had a habit of now and then falling off sideways, and as he generally did this on the side of which Alice was walking, she soon found it was best plan not to walk quite so close to the horse. Where is it? I'm afraid you've not had much practice in riding, she ventured to say, as she was helping him up from his fifth tumble. The knight looked very much surprised, and a little offended at the remark. What makes you say that? He asked, as he scrambled back into the saddle, keeping hold of Alice's hair with one hand to save him from falling over on the other side. The knight looked very much surprised, and a little offended at the remark. What makes you say that? He asked, as he scrambled back into the saddle, keeping hold of Alice's hair with one hand to save himself from falling over on the other side. Well, because people don't fall off quite so often when they've had much practice. I've had plenty of practice, the knight said very gravely. Plenty of practice. Alice could think of nothing better to say than, Indeed? But she said it as heartily as she could. They went on a little way in silence after this, the knight with his eyes shut, muttering to himself, and Alice watching anxiously for the next tumble. The great art of riding, the knight suddenly began in a loud voice, waving his arms as he spoke, is to keep. Here the sentence ended as suddenly as it had begun, as the knight fell heavily on top of his head, exactly in the path where Alice was walking. She was quite frightened this time, and said in an anxious tone as she picked him up, I hope no bones were broken. None to speak of, the knight said, as if he didn't mind breaking 2 or 3 of them. It's just a flesh wound. Just a scratch. The great art of riding, as I was saying, is to keep your balance properly. Like this, you know. He let go of the bridle and stretched out both his arms to show Alice what he meant, and this time he fell flat on his back, right under the horse's feet. Here's a picture of the knight, in, like, action to falling forward. But there we are. Plenty of practice, he went on repeating all the time that Alice was getting him onto his feet. Plenty of practice. Why, it's too ridiculous, cried Alice, losing all her patience this time. You ought to have a wooden horse on wheels, that you ought. Does that kind go smoothly? The knight asked in a tone of great interest, clasping his arms round the horse's neck as he spoke, just in time to save himself from tumbling off again. Oh, much smoothly. Much more smoothly than a live horse, Alice said with a little scream of laughter, in spite of all she could do to prevent it. Well, get one, the knight said thoughtfully to himself. 1 or 2. Several. There was a short silence after this, and then the knight went on again. I'm a great hand at inventing things. Now, I dare say you noticed, the last time you picked me up, that I was looking rather thoughtful. You were a little grave, said Alice. Well, just then I was inventing a new way of getting over a gate. Would you like to hear it? Oh, very much indeed, said Alice politely. Well, I'll tell you how I came to think of it, said the knight. You see, I said to myself, the only difference is the feet. The head is high enough already. Now first I put my head on top of the gate, then the head's high enough, then I stand on my head, then the feet are high enough, you see? Then I'm over. You see? Yes, I suppose you'd be over when that was done, said Alice thoughtfully. But don't you think it would be rather hard? I haven't tried it yet, the knight said gravely, so I can't tell for certain. But I'm afraid it would be a little hard. He looked so vexed at the idea that Alice changed the subject hastily. What a curious helmet you've got, she said cheerfully. Is that your invention too? The knight looked down proudly at his helmet, which hung from the saddle. Yes, he said, but I've invented a better one than that, like a sugar loaf. When I used to wear it, if I fell off the horse, it always touched the ground directly. So I had a very little way to fall, you see? But there was the danger of falling into it for sure. That happened to me once, and the worst of it was, before I could get out again, the other white knight came and put it on. He thought it was his own helmet. The knight looked so solemn about it that Alice did not dare to laugh. "Well, I'm afraid you must have hurt him," she said in a trembling voice, "being on top of his head." "I had to kick him, of course," the knight said very seriously. "And then he took the helmet off again. But it took hours and hours to get me out. I was as fast as lightning, you know." "But that's a different kind of fastness," Alice objected. The knight shook his head. "It was all kinds of fastness with me, I can assure you," he said. He raised his hands in some excitement as he said this, and instantly rolled out of the saddle and fell headlong into a deep ditch. Here is a picture of the knight having fallen into said ditch and Alice trying to pull him out. Alice ran to the side of the ditch to look for him. She was rather startled by the fall, as for some time she had kept on very well, and she was afraid that he really was hurt this time. However, though she could see nothing but the soles of his feet, she was much relieved to hear that he was talking on his usual tone. "All kinds of fastness," he repeated. "But it was careless of him to put another man's helmet on, with the man in it, too." "Oh, how can you go on talking so quietly, head downwards?" Alice asked as she dragged him out by the feet and laid him in a heap on the bank. The knight looked surprised at the question. "What does it matter where my body happens to be?" he said. "My mind goes on working all the same. In fact, the more head downwards I am, the more I keep inventing new things. Now, the cleverest thing of the sort that I ever did," he went on, after a pause, "was inventing a new pudding during the meat course." "In time to have it cooked for the next course?" said Alice. "Well, that was quick work, certainly." "Well, not the next course," the king said in a slow, thoughtful tone. "No, certainly not the next course." "Well, then it would have to be the next day. I suppose you wouldn't have two pudding courses in one dinner." "Well, not the next day," the knight repeated as before. "Not the next day. In fact," he went on, holding his head down and his voice getting lower and lower, "I don't believe that pudding ever was cooked. In fact, I don't believe that pudding ever will be cooked. And yet it was a very clever pudding to invent." "What did you mean of it? What did you mean it to be made of?" Alice asked, hoping to cheer him up, for the poor knight seemed quite low-spirited about it. "Well, it began with blotting paper," the knight answered, with a groan. "That wouldn't be very nice, I'm afraid." "Now, very nice alone," he interrupted quite eagerly, "but you've no idea what a difference it makes mixing it with other things, such as gunpowder and sealing wax. And here I must leave you." They had come to the end of the wood. Alice could only look puzzled. She was thinking of the pudding. "You are sad," the knight said in an anxious tone. "Let me sing you a song to comfort me." "To comfort you, not me." "I will sing you a song to comfort me." "Is it very long?" Alice asked, for she had heard a good deal of poetry that day. "It's long," said the knight, "but it's very, very beautiful. Everybody that hears me sing it, either it brings the tears into the eyes, or else—" "Well, or else what?" said Alice, for the knight had made a sudden pause. "Or else it doesn't, you know. The name of the song is called Haddock's Eyes." "Oh, that's the name of the song, is it?" Alice said, trying to feel interested. "No, you don't understand," the knight said, looking a little vexed. "That's what the name is called. The name really is The Aged Man." "Then I ought to have said—" "That's what the song is called," Alice corrected herself. "No, you oughtn't. That's quite another thing. The song is called Ways and Means, but that's only what it's called, you know." "Well, what is the song, then?" said Alice, who was by this time completely bewildered. "I'm coming to that," the knight said. "The song really is A Sittin' on a Gate, and the tune's my own invention." So saying, He stopped his horse and let the reins fall on its neck, then, slowly beating time with one hand, and with a faint smile lighting up his gentle, foolish face, as if he enjoyed the music of his song, he began. Of the strange things that Alice saw in her journey through the looking-glass, this was one that she always remembered most clearly. Years afterwards she could bring herself the whole scene back again, as if it had been only yesterday. The mild blue eyes and kindly smile of the knight, the setting sun gleaming through his hair and shining on his armor in a blaze of light that quite dazzled her. The horse quietly moved about, with the reins hanging loose on his neck, cropping the grass at her feet, and the black shadow of the forest behind. All this she took in like a picture, as, with one hand shading her eyes, she leant against a tree, watching the strange pair, and listening in a half-dream to the melancholy music of the song. But the tune isn't his own invention, she said to herself. It's I give thee all, I can no more. She stood and listened very attentively, but no tears came into her eyes. I'll tell thee everything I can. There's little to relate. I saw an aged man, a-sitting on a gate. Who are you, aged man? I said, and how is it you live? And his answer trickled through my head like water through a sieve. He said, I look for butterflies that sleep among the wheat. I make them into mutton pies and sell them in the street. I sell them unto men, he said, who sail on stormy seas, and that's the way I get my bread. A trifle, if you please. But I was thinking of a plan to dye one's whiskers green, and always use so large a fan that they could not be seen. So, having no reply to give to what the old man said, I cried, Come, tell me how you live, and thumped him on the head. His accents mild took up the tale. He said, I go my ways, and when I find a mountain rill, I set it in a blaze. And thence they came a stuff they call Rowland's Macassar oil. There's an asterisk, and it says a hairdressing. Yet 2 pence halfpenny is all they give me for my toil. But I was thinking a way to feed oneself on batter, and so go on from day to day, getting a little fatter. I shook him well from side to side until his face was blue. Come, tell me how you live, I cried, and what it is you do. He said, I hunt for haddocks' eyes among the heather bright, and work them into waistcoat buttons in the silent night. And these I do not sell for gold, or coin, or silvery shine, but for a copper halfpenny, and that will purchase mine. I sometimes dig for buttered rolls, or set limed twigs for crabs. Limed twigs, there's an asterisk there, and it says small branches covered in bird lime used to trap birds. I sometimes dig for buttered rolls or set limed twigs for crabs. I sometimes search the grassy knolls for wheels of handsome cabs, although those crabs are looking pretty handsome. And that's the way, he gave a wink, by which I get my wealth, and very glad will I drink your honour's noble health. I heard him then, for I had just completed my design to keep the Menai bridge from rust by boiling it in wine. I thanked him much for telling me the way he got his wealth, but chiefly for his wish that he might drink my noble health. And now if e'er by chance I put my fingers into glue, or madly squeeze a right-handed foot into a left-hand shoe, or if I drop upon my toe a very heavy weight, I weep, for it reminds me so of that old man I used to know, whose look was mild, whose speech was slow, whose hair was whiter than the snow, whose face was very like a crow, with eyes like cinders all aglow, who seemed distracted with his row, who rocked his body to and fro, and muttered, mumbling softly and low, as if his mouth were full of dough, and who snorted like a buffalo, that summer evening long ago, a-sitting on a gate. As the knight sang the last words of the ballad, he gathered up the reins and turned his horse's head along the road by which they had come. "You've only a few yards to go," he said, "down the hill and over that little brook, and then you'll be a queen. But you'll stay and see me off first?" he added, as Alice turned with an eager look in the direction to which he pointed. "I shan't be long. You'll wait and wave your handkerchief when I get to that turn in the road. I think it'll encourage me, you see." "Of course I'll wait," said Alice, "and thank you very much for coming so far, and for the song. I liked it very much." "I hope so," the knight said doubtfully, "but you didn't cry as much as I thought you would." So they shook hands, and then the knight rode slowly away into the forest. "It won't take long to see him off, I suppose, or I expect," Alice said to herself as she stood watching him. "There he goes, right on his head as usual. However, he gets up again pretty easily. That comes of having so many things hung round the horse." So she went on talking to herself as she watched the horse walking leisurely along the road, and the knight tumbling off, first on one side and then on the other. After the fourth or fifth tumble he reached the turn, and then she waved her handkerchief to him, and waited till he was out of sight. "Oh, I hope it encouraged him," she said, as she turned to run down the hill. "And now for the last brook, and to be a queen. Oh, how grand that sounds!" A very few steps brought her to the edge of the brook. "The 8th square, at last!" she cried, as she bounded across, and threw herself down to rest on a lawn as soft as moss, with the little flower beds dotted around it here and there. "Oh, how glad I am to be here! And what is this on my head?" she exclaimed in a tone of dismay, as she put her hands up to something very heavy that fitted tight all round her head. "But how can it have got there without my knowing it?" she said to herself, as she lifted it off and set it on her lap to make out what it could possibly be. It was a golden crown. End of chapter 8. That's how you become a queen. Obviously, it is as simple as that. You have to make it to the 8th square. Boom. Use a queen. Not by birth. No, no, don't be silly. Okay, so chapter 7, we have our knights. We have our knights. They are fighting. So, well, okay. Stop. Let's back up a little bit. Alice wakes up and there's like nobody really around, and she's like, "Am I dreaming? No, I can't be dreaming because I just woke up. Maybe we're all dreaming the same dream, and I hope that we're all in my dream because I don't want to be in somebody else's dream. How embarrassing." And then the Red Knight scoops up and is going to take her prisoner, and then the White Knight comes over and rescues her. They have a little fight. They keep falling off their horse, and it is silly. But then the White Knight wins and takes Alice off to the next square that she needs to go to become a queen. And as they're going along, he's talking about all of these inventions, which are just so silly. So silly. And to stop from your hair from falling down, you have to, keep it a certain way, because then it can't fall down if it's already down, and blah, 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 blah. And then the knight is like, do you want me to sing you a song? And Alice is like, heck yes, I want you to sing me a song, but is it long? And then the knight is like, you bet your boots it is. And so then he just starts singing this song. And then they make it to where the knight is going to be ending off. And he's like, all right, you just have to go down this hill, through the brook, and then you will be a queen. I'm going to see myself out of here. All right. Chapter 9. Queen Alice. "Well, this is grand," said Alice. "I never expected I should be queen so soon. And I'll tell you what it is, your majesty," she went on in a severe tone. She was always rather fond of scolding herself. "It'll never do for you to be lolling around in the grass like that. Queens have to be dignified, you know." So she got up and walked about, rather stiffly, just at first, as she was afraid that the crown might come off. but she comforted herself at the thought that there was nobody to see here. "And if I'm really a queen," she said as she sat down again, "I shall be able to manage it quite well in time." Everything was happening so oddly, but she didn't feel a bit surprised at finding the Red Queen and the White Queen sitting close to her. On one on each side. She would have liked very much to ask them how they came here, but she feared it would not quite be civil. However, there would be no harm, she thought, in asking if the game was over. "Please, would you tell me?" she began, looking timidly at the Red Queen. "Speak when you are spoken to," the Queen sharply interrupted her. "But if everybody obeyed that rule," said Alice, who was always ready for a little argument, "and if you only spoke when you were spoken to, and the other person always waited for you to begin, you see nobody would ever say anything, so that—" "Ridiculous!" cried the Queen. "Why don't you see, child—" Here she broke off with a frown, and, after thinking for a minute, suddenly changed the subject of the conversation. "What do you mean, if you really are a queen? What right have you to call yourself so? You can't be a queen. You know till you've passed the proper examination, and the sooner we begin it, the better." "Oh, I only said if," poor Alice pleaded in a piteous tone. The two queens looked at each other, and the Red Queen remarked with a little shudder, She says she only said if." "But if she said a great deal more than that," the White Queen moaned, wringing her hands, "oh, ever so much more than that." "So you did, you know," the Queen said to Alice. "Always speak the truth. Think before you speak, and write it down afterwards." "Well, I'm sure I didn't mean—" Alice was beginning, but the Red Queen interrupted her impatiently. "That's just what I complain of. You should have meant— What do you suppose is the use of a child without any meaning? Even a joke should have some meaning, and a child's more important than a joke, I hope. You couldn't deny that, even if you tried with both hands." "I don't deny things with my hands," Alice objected. "Nobody said you did," said the Queen. "I said you couldn't if you tried." "She's in that state of mind," said the White Queen, "that she wants to deny something, only she doesn't know what to deny." "A nasty, vicious temper," the Red Queen remarked, and then there was an uncomfortable silence for a minute or two. The Red Queen broke the silence by saying to the White Queen, "I invite you to Alice's dinner party this afternoon." The White Queen smiled fondly and said, "And I invite you." "I didn't know I was to have a party at all," said Alice. "But if there was to be one, I think I ought to invite the guests." "We gave you the opportunity of doing it," the Red Queen remarked, "but I dare say you've not had many lessons in manners yet." "Manners are not taught in lessons," said Alice. "Lessons can teach you to do sums and things of that sort." "Can you do addition?" the White Queen asked. "What's 1 and 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 1?" "I don't know," said Alice. I lost count." "She can't do addition," the Red Queen interrupted. "Can you do subtraction? Take 9 from 8. 9 from 8, I can't, you know," Alice replied very readily. "But she can't do subtraction," said the White Queen. "Can you do division? Divide a loaf by a knife? What's the answer to that?" "I suppose—" Alice was beginning, but the Red Queen answered for her. "Bread and butter, of course. Try another subtraction sum. Take a bone from a dog. What remains?" Alice considered. "The bone wouldn't remain, of course. If I took it, and the dog wouldn't remain, it would come to bite me, and I'm sure I shouldn't remain." "Then you think nothing would remain?" said the Red Queen. "Well, I think that's the answer." "Wrong, as usual," said the Red Queen. "The dog's temper would remain." "Well, I don't see how—" "Why, look here," the Red queen cried. "The dog would lose its temper, wouldn't it?" But perhaps it would, Alice replied cautiously. "Then if the dog went away, its temper would remain," the queen exclaimed triumphantly. Alice said as gravely as she could, "Oh, they might go different ways." But she couldn't help thinking to herself, "What dreadful nonsense they are talking." "You can't do sums a bit," the queens said together with great emphasis. "Oh, can you do sums?" Alice said, turning suddenly on the White Queen, for she didn't like being found fault with so much. The queen gasped and shut her eyes. "I can do addition," she said, "if you give me time, but I can't do subtraction under any circumstance." "Of course you know your ABC," said the Red Queen. "To be sure I do," said Alice. "So do I," the White Queen whispered. "We'll often say it over together, dear. And I'll tell you a secret. I can read words of one letter. Isn't that grand? However, don't be discouraged. You'll come to it in time." Here the Red Queen began again. "Can you answer useful questions?" she said. "How is bread made?" "Oh, I know that," Alice cried eagerly. "You take some flour." "Where do you pick the flour?" the Queen asked. "In a garden, or in the hedges." "Well, it isn't picked at all," Alice exclaimed. "It's ground." "How many acres of ground?" asked the White Queen. "You mustn't leave out so many things." "Fan her head," the Queen anxiously interrupted. She'll be feverish after so much thinking." So they set to work and fanned her with bunches of leaves, till she had to beg them to leave off. It blew her hair about so. "She's all right again now," said the Red Queen. "Do you know languages? What's the French for fiddle-dee-dee?" "Fiddle-dee-dee's not English," Alice replied gravely. "Who ever said that it was?" said the Red Queen. Alice thought she saw a way out of the difficulty this time. "If you'll tell me what language fiddle-dee-dee is, I'll tell you the French for it," she exclaimed triumphantly. But the Red Queen drew herself up rather stiffly and said, "Queens never make bargains." "Oh, I wish queens never asked questions," Alice thought to herself. "Don't let us quarrel," the White Queen said in an anxious tone. "What is the cause of lightning?" "The cause of lightning," Alice said very decidedly, for she felt quite certain about this, "is the thunder. No, no," she hastily requested herself, "I meant the other way." "It's too late to correct it," said the Red Queen. "When you've once said a thing, that fixes it, and you must take the consequences." "Which reminds me," the White Queen said, looking down and nervously clasping and unclasping her hands. "We had such a thunderstorm last Tuesday. I mean one of the last set of Tuesdays, you know." Alice was puzzled. "In our country," she remarked, "there's only one day at a time." The Red Queen said, "That's a poor, thin way of doing things. Now here we mostly have days and nights 2 or 3 at a time, and sometimes in the winter we take as many as 5 nights together, for warmth, you know." "Are 5 nights warmer than 1 night, then?" Alice ventured to ask. 5 times as warm, of course." "But they should be 5 times as cold by the same rule." "Just so," cried the Red Queen. 5 times as warm and 5 times as cold, just as I'm 5 times as rich as you are and 5 times as clever." Alice sighed and gave it up. "It's exactly like a riddle with no answer," she thought. "Oh, Humpty Dumpty saw it too," the White Queen went on in a low voice, more as if she was talking to herself. "He came to the door with a corkscrew in his hand." "What did he want?" said the Red Queen. "Oh, he said he would come in," the White Queen went on, "because he was looking for a hippopotamus. Now, as it happened, there wasn't such a thing in the house that morning." "Is there generally?" Alice asked in an astonished tone. "Well, only on Thursdays," said the Queen. "I know what he came for," said Alice. "He wanted to punish the fish because Here the White Queen began again. "It was such a thunderstorm, you can't think." "She never could, you know," said the Red Queen. "And part of the roof came off, and ever so much thunder got in, and it went rolling around the room in great lumps, and knocking over the tables and things, till I was so frightened I couldn't remember my own name." Alice thought to herself, "I should try to remember my name in the middle of an accident. Where would be the use of it?" But she did not say this aloud, for fear of hurting the poor Queen's feelings. "Your Majesty must excuse her," the Red Queen said to Alice, taking one of the White Queen's hands in her own and gently stroking it. "She means well, but she can't help saying foolish things as a general rule." The White Queen looked timidly at Alice, who felt she ought to say something kind, but really couldn't think of anything at the moment. "She never was really well brought up," the Red Queen went on, "but it's amazing how good-tempered she is. Pat her on the head and see how pleased she'll be." But this was more than Alice had courage to do. A little kinder, and putting her hair in papers, would do her wonders. The White Queen gave a deep sigh and laid her head on Alice's shoulder. "Oh, I am so sleepy," she moaned. "She's tired, poor thing," said the Red Queen. "Smooth her hair, lend her your nightcap, and sing her a smoothing lullaby." "Oh, I haven't got a nightcap with me," said Alice, as she tried to obey the first direction. "And I don't know any soothing lullabies." "I must do it myself, then," said the Red Queen, and she began, "Hush a by, lady, in Alice's lap. Till the feast's ready, we've come time for a nap. When the feast's over, we'll go to the ball, Red Queen and White Queen and Alice and all. And now you know the words," she added, as she put her head down on Alice's other shoulder. "Just sing it through to me. I'm getting sleepy, too." In another moment both queens were fast asleep and snoring loud. "What am I to do?" exclaimed Alice, looking about in great perplexity, at first one round head, and then the other, rolled down from her shoulder and lay like a heavy lump in her lap. Here is Alice, with the two queens sleeping next to her. Well, I don't think it ever happened before that anyone had to take care of two queens asleep at once. No, not in all the history of England. It couldn't, you know, because there never was more than one queen at a time. Oh, do wake up, you heavy things," she went on in an impatient tone. But there was no answer, but a gentle snoring. The snoring got more distinct every minute, and sounded more like a tune. At last she could even make out words, and she listened so eagerly that, when the two great heads suddenly vanished from her lap, she hardly missed them. She was standing before an arched doorway, over which were the words "Queen Alice" in large letters, and on each side of the arch there was a bell handle, one marked "Visitor's Bell," and the other "Servant's Bell." "Oh, I'll wait till the song's over," thought Alice, "and then I'll ring the bell. Which bell must I ring?" she went on, very much puzzled by the names. "I'm not a visitor, and I'm not a servant. There ought to be one marked Queen, you know." Just then the door opened a little way, and a creature with a long beak put its head out for a moment and said, "No admittance till the week over next," and shut the door again with a bang. Alice knocked and rang in vain for a long time, but at last a very old frog, who was sitting under a tree, got up and hobbled slowly towards her. He was dressed in bright yellow and had enormous boots on. "What is it now?" the frog said in a deep, hoarse whisper. Alice turned round, ready to find fault with anybody. "Where's the servant whose business it is to answer the door?" she began angrily. "Which door?" said the frog. Alice almost stamped with irritation at the slow drawl in which he spoke. "This door, of course." The frog looked at the door with large, dull eyes for a minute. Then he went nearer and rubbed it with his thumb, as if he were trying whether the paint would come off. Then he looked at Alice. To answer the door, he went on. What's it been asking of? He was so hoarse that Alice could scarcely hear him. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "I speaks English, doesn't I?" the frog went on. "Or are you deaf? What did it ask you?" "What, nothing," Alice said, impatient. "I've been knocking at it." "Shouldn't do that. Shouldn't do that," the frog muttered. "Wexes it, you know." Then he went up and gave the door a kick with one of his great feet. "You let it alone," he panted out as he hobbled back to his tree, "and it'll let you alone, you know?" At this moment the door was flung open and a shrill voice was heard singing. Before we start singing, here is the frog and Alice at the door.
To the looking-glass world it was Alice that said, "I've a sceptre in hand, I've a crown on my head. Let the looking-glass creatures, whatever they be, come and dine with the Red Queen, the White Queen, and me."
And hundreds of voices joined in the chorus. Then fill up the glasses as quick as they can, and sprinkle the table with buttons and bran. Put cats in the coffee and mice in the tea, and welcome Queen Alice with 30 times 3. Then followed a confused noise of cheering, and Alice thought to herself, 30 times 3 makes 99. I wonder if anyone's counting. In a minute there was silence again, and the same shrill voice sang another verse.
"Oh, looking-glass creatures," quoth Alice, "draw near. 'Tis an hour to see me, a favor to hear. 'Tis a privilege high to have dinner and tea along with the Red Queen, the White Queen, and me."
Then came the chorus again. Then fill up the glasses with treacle and ink, or anything else that is pleasant to drink. Mix sand with the cider and wool with the wine, and welcome Queen Alice, and 90 times 9. 90 times 9, Alice repeated in despair. Oh, that'll never be. I'd better go in at once. And in she went, and there was a dead silence the moment she appeared. Alice glanced nervously along the table as she walked up the large hall and noticed that there were about 50 guests of all kinds. Some were animals, some birds, and there were even a few flowers among them. "I'm glad they've come without waiting to be asked," she thought. "I should never have known who were the right people to invite." There were 3 chairs at the head of the table. The red and white queens had already taken 2 of them, but the middle one was empty. Alice sat down in it, rather uncomfortable at the silence, and longing for someone to speak. At last the Red Queen said, "You've missed the soup and the fish," she said. "Put on the joint." And the waiters set a leg of mutton before Alice, who looked at it rather anxiously, as she had never had to carve a joint before. "You look a little shy. Let me introduce you to that leg of mutton," said the Red Queen. "Alice, mutton, mutton, Alice." The leg of mutton got up in the dish and made a little bow to Alice, and Alice returned the bow, not knowing whether to be frightened or amused. "May I give you a slice?" she said, taking up the knife and fork and looking from one queen to the other. "Certainly not," the Red Queen said very decidedly. "It isn't etiquette to cut anyone you've just been introduced to. Remove the joint." And the waiters carried it off, and brought a large plum pudding in its place. "Oh, I won't be introduced to the pudding, please," Alice said rather hastily, "or we shall get no dinner at all. May I give you some?" But the Red Queen looked sulky and growled, "Pudding, Alice, Alice, pudding. Remove the pudding." And the waiters took it away so quickly that Alice couldn't return its bow. However, she didn't see why the Red Queen should be the only one to give orders, so as an experiment she called out, "Waiter, bring back the pudding." And there it was again, in the moment, like a conjuring trick. It was so large that she couldn't help feeling a little shy with it, as she had been with the mutton. However, she conquered her shyness by a great effort and cut a slice and handed it to the Queen. There is a picture of the mutton bowing to Alice. Beautiful. The manners. What
What impertinence, said the pudding. I wonder how you'd like it if I were to cut a slice out of you, you creature.
It spoke in a thick, sooty sort of voice, which was absolutely the exact voice that I did, so don't you dare question me. And Alice hadn't a word to say in reply. She could only sit and look at it and gasp. What a make a remark, said the Red Queen. It's ridiculous to leave all the conversation to the pudding. Do you know, I've had such a quantity of poetry repeated to me today, Alice began, a little frightened at finding that the moment she opened her lips there was dead silence, and all eyes were fixed upon her. And it's a very curious thing, I think. Every poem was about fishes in some way. Do you know why they're so fond of fishes all about here? She spoke to the Red Queen, whose answer was a little wide of the mark. As to fishes, she said very slowly and solemnly, putting her mouth close to Alice's ear, Her White Majesty knows a lovely riddle, all in poetry, all about fishes. Shall she repeat it? Her Red Majesty's very kind to mention it, the White Queen murmured into Alice's other ear, in a voice like the cooing of a pigeon. It would be such a treat. May I? Oh, please do, Alice said very politely. The White Queen laughed with delight and stroked Alice's cheek. Then she began. First, the fish must be caught. That is easy. A baby, I think, could have caught it. Next, the fish must be bought. That is easy. A penny, I think, would have bought it. Now cook me the fish. That is easy, and will not take more than a minute. Let it lie in a dish. That is easy, because it is already in it. Bring it here, let me sup. It is easy to set such a dish on a table. Take the dish cover up. Ah, that is so hard that I fear I am unable, for it holds it like glue, holds the lid to the dish, while it lies in the middle, which is easiest to do. Undish cover the fish, or dish cover the riddle. Take a minute to think about it, and then guess, said the Red Queen. Meanwhile, we'll drink your health. Queen, Alice's health, she screamed at the top of her voice, and all the guests began drinking it directly, and very oddly they managed it. Some of them put their glasses upon their heads like extinguishers, and drank all that trickled down their faces. Others set up the decanters, and drank the wine as it ran off the edges of the table, and 3 of them, who looked like kangaroos, scrambled into the dish of roast mutton, and began eagerly lapping up the gravy. Just like pigs in a trough, thought Alice. You ought to return thanks in a neat speech, the Red Queen said, frowning at Alice as she spoke. Oh, we must support you, you know, the White Queen whispered as Alice got up to do it very obediently, but a little frightened. Oh, thank you very much, she whispered in reply, but I can't do quite well without. That wouldn't be at all the thing, the Red Queen said very decidedly, so Alice tried to submit to it with a good grace. And they did so push it. And they did push so. Jeez, she said afterwards when she was telling her sister the history of the feast. You would have thought they wanted to squeeze me flat. In fact, it was rather difficult to keep her in place while she made her speech. The 2 queens pushed her so, one on one side, that they nearly lifted her up into the air. I shall rise to return thanks, Alice began, and she really did rise as she spoke, several inches, but she got hold of the edge of the table and managed to pull herself down again. Oh, take care of yourself, screamed the White Queen, seizing Alice's hair with both her hands. Something's going to happen. And then, as Alice afterwards described it, all sorts of things happened in a moment. The candles all grew up to the ceiling, looking something like a bed of rushes with fireworks at the top. As to the bottles, they each took a pair of plates which they hastily fitted on as wigs, and so, with forks for legs, they went fluttering about in all directions, and very like birds they look. Alice thought to herself, as well as she could in the dreadful confusion that was beginning. At this moment she heard a hoarse laugh at her side, and turned to see what was the matter with the White Queen, but instead of the Queen, there was the leg of mutton, sitting in the chair. "Here I am," cried a voice from the soup tureen, and Alice turned again just in time to see the Queen's broad, good-natured face grinning at her for a moment over the edge of the tureen before she disappeared into the soup. There was not a moment to be lost. Already several of the guests were lying down in the dishes, and the soup ladle was walking up the table towards Alice's chair and beckoning to her impatiently to get out of the way. "Oh, I can't stand this any longer," she cried, as she jumped up and seized the tablecloth with both hands. With one good pull, and plates, dishes, guests, and candles came crashing down together in a heap on the floor. There's a picture of Alice pulling the tablecloth and everything, just getting wild and crazy. "And as for you," she went on, turning fiercely upon the Red Queen, whom she considered as the cause of all this mischief. But the Queen was no longer at her side. She had suddenly dwindled down to the size of a little doll, and was now on the table, merrily running round and round after her own shawl, which was trailing behind her. At any other time Alice would have felt surprised at this, but she was far too much excited to be surprised at anything now. "As for you," she repeated, catching hold of the little creature in the very act of jumping over a bottle which had just lighted upon the table, "I'll shake you into a kitten, that I will." Chapter 10. Oh, that was the end of chapter 9. Apologies. The end of chapter 9. Okay, so Alice is now a queen. And all of a sudden, she is sitting next to the Red Queen and the White Queen, and they are taking a nap. And they're like, "Alice, sing to us." And Alice is like, "Well, I don't know any lullabies." And so the Red Queen recites a lullaby and then lays down on Alice's shoulder and is like, "Okay, now you sing to both of us." And Alice is like, "Well, but also the Red Queen invites the White Queen to tea for Alice's celebration, and the White Queen invites the Red Queen to the celebration for Alice's whatever. Um, so Alice is like, "All right, well, this is silly," and leaves and finds two doors, and then finds a third door because she doesn't really know like which door to go to, because one is marked servants and the other is marked something else. I don't remember. But she has a silly interaction with a frog, and then she goes in, and everybody is seated. There is some singing, and as soon as people see her, they stop the singing, they stop everything. At the head of the table are 3 chairs. The Red Queen is already there, the White Queen is already there, and the middle chair is just for Alice. And so she goes and she sits, and they've already had fish and soup. And so they bring out the mutton, and Alice is like, "Well, I'm going to carve the mutton." And the Red Queen is like, "Oh, you look a little uncomfortable. Let me introduce you. Mutton, Alice, Alice, mutton. Oh, you can't possibly cut the mutton now. You've just met." So mutton goes away. Pudding comes in. Pudding, Alice, Alice. Pudding, the pudding goes away. Alice is like, "This is ridiculous. Bring the pudding back." And the pudding comes back. And then just chaos ensues. That's all it is. It's just chaos. There's speeches are said, chaos happens. Alice is tired of this, grabs the tablecloth and pulls really hard, and everything just goes flying. And then the Red Queen shrinks down and down and down and down, and Alice is like, "I am going to grab you and I'm going to shake you until you turn into a kitten, because what else would you turn into? Obviously, a kitten." And that's where chapter 9 ended. And a chapter 10. Shaking. She took her off the table as she spoke, and shook her backwards and forwards with all of her might. The Red Queen made no resistance whatever, only her face grew very small, and her eyes got large and green, and still, as Alice went on shaking her, she kept on growing shorter and fatter and softer and rounder and Chapter 11. Waking. And it really was a kitten, after all. Okay, so there she is, shaking the queen, and then she turns into a kitten, obviously. Chapter 12. Which dreamed it? "Oh, your red majesty shouldn't purr so loud," Alice said, rubbing her eyes and addressing the kitten respectfully, yet with some severity. "You woke me out of—" "Oh, such a nice dream. And you've been along with me, Kitty, all through the looking-glass world. Did you know it, dear?" This very inconvenient habit of kittens, Alice had said once, that whatever you say to them, they always purr. If they would only purr for yes and mew for no, or any rule of that sort, she had said, so that one could keep up a conversation. But how can you talk with a person if they always say the same thing? On this occasion, the kitten only purred, and it was impossible to guess whether it meant yes or no. So Alice hunted among the chessmen on the table till she found the red queens. Then she went down on her knees on the hearthrug and put the kitten and the queen to look at each other. "Now, Kitty," she cried, clapping her hands triumphantly, "confess that was what you turned into." "But it wouldn't look at it," she said when she was explaining the thing afterwards to her sister. "It turned its head away and pretended not to see it, but it looked a little ashamed of itself, so I think it must have been the Red Queen." "Sit up a little more stiffly, dear," Alice cried, with a merry laugh, "and curtsy while you're thinking what to purr. It saves time, remember." And she caught it up and gave it one little kiss, just in honor of its having been a Red Queen. "Snowdrop, my pet," she went on, looking over her shoulder at the white kitten, which was still patiently undergoing its toilet. I know what it means, like, she's, like, grooming herself, but still. "Excuse me, I don't think you need to be bothering little Snowdrop while she's, undergoing its toilet." "When will Dinah have finished with your white majesty, I wonder? That must be the reason you were so untidy in my dream. Dinah, do you know that you're scrubbing a white queen? Well, it's most disrespectful of you. And what did Dinah turn into, I wonder?" she prattled on, as she settled comfortably down, with one elbow on the rug and her chin on her hand, to watch the kittens. "Dear me, Dinah, did you turn to Humpty Dumpty? I think you did. However, you'd better not mention it to your friends just yet, for I'm not sure. By the way, Kitty, if only you'd been really with me in my dream, there was one thing you would have enjoyed. I had such a quantity of poetry said to me, all about fishes. Tomorrow morning you shall have a real treat. All the time you're eating your breakfast, I'll repeat 'The Walrus and the Carpenter' to you, and then you can make believe it's oysters, dear. Now, Kitty, let's consider who it was that dreamed it all. This is a serious question, my dear, and you should not go on licking your paw like that, as if Dinah hadn't washed you this morning. You see, Kitty, it must have been either me or the Red King. He was part of my dream, of course, but then I was part of his dream, too. Was it the Red King, Kitty? You were his wife, my dear. You ought to know. Oh, Kitty, do help to settle it. I'm sure your paw can wait." But the provoking kitten only began on the other paw, and pretended it hadn't heard the question. "What do you think it was?" A boat beneath a sunny day. A boat beneath a sunny sky, lingering onward dreamily in the evening of July. Children three there nestle near, eager eye and willing ear, pleased a simple tale to hear. Long has paled that sunny sky, echoes fade and memories die. Autumn frosts have slain July, still she haunts me, phantom wise. Alice moving under skies never seen by waking eyes. Children yet, the tale to hear, eager eye and willing ear, lovingly shall nestle near. In a wonderland they lie, dreaming as the days go by, dreaming as the summers die, ever drifting down the stream, lingering in the golden gleam. Life, what is it but a dream? The end. Was that some good ASMR or was that scary? I feel like that was scary. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to startle you all. But we did it. We finished it. We finished both Alice's Adventure in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, and I gotta say, I liked it. It's interesting that the like Tim Burton one was, I feel like, really close. I feel like it was really close to them in how they were like perceived. Like there's jokes or like callbacks in those movies that like you don't necessarily get in the other adaptations. But I really liked it. I like Alice. I think she is an innovator at 7.5. And yeah, it was fun. It was a fun, silly romp. It was a good time for a romp too. I feel like our books were a little bit downers there for a while, which is okay. Which is okay, because we'll probably go back to another downer next. So yes, that was it for today. We will do this again. We'll do this again next time. We'll start a new book on next time. I always forget what day it is, so I try not to say what day it is. We'll start a new book next time. It will be grand. It will be glorious. But yeah, we're gonna end it here. I could talk for another 20 minutes, but I'm not going to. Or another 30 minutes, but I'm not going to. So, have a good night, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. As always, you're all so generous and good to me, and I thank you. Thank you. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you, and I 1000% appreciate your support. If I do not see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Goodbye.